Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors and do a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's show, I'm talking to the wonderful and much loved Sairish Hussain about her new novel, Hidden Fires. Sairish was one of the first guests of the show back in 2022, and so it's so lovely to have her back on the show talking about her new novel. When debut novels are a success, it can be really daunting to pick up the second novel of the author, wondering if it will be just as amazing as the first. But friends, I can confirm that Hidden Fires is incredible. It's the moving story of loss, grief, and secrets buried deep within, and the beautiful, unlikely friendship between a grandfather, Yusuf, and his teenage granddaughter, Ruby. In her novel, Sairish writes about family, mental health, growing up, and the Partition of India. Sairish Hussain is a Bradford-based author and lecturer in creative writing. Her debut novel, The Family Tree, was published by HarperCollins and shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award. Also, the Portico Prize and the Diverse Book Awards. It was also longlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award and winner of the Calibre Audio's Hidden Gem Prize. Sairish was selected by Kei Miller as one of the 10 unmissable writers working in the UK for the International Literature Showcase 2021. She was one of the finalists in the Women's Prize and Good Housekeeping Futures Award, an initiative which celebrates the most promising emerging female authors today. Hidden Fires is her second novel, and I'm so glad that she's my guest today. Hi, Sairish, welcome. Well, welcome back to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It is so good to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Samia. Thank you for having me. And you just told me that I was your third guest, and now I'm your 70 something?
67th. Yeah.
67th. Okay, look how far we've come. Well done, you.
Well done you as well. So you were on the show last time when we were talking about your stunning debut, The Family Tree. And now we are back talking about your latest book, which is Hidden Fires, which, oh my gosh, obviously we will be talking about throughout the entire episode, but is absolutely stunning, really beautiful. The story is very different from that of The Family Tree, but tell me a little bit like what it's been like for you sort of getting the second book out, working on it. Obviously there were quite a few years between this one and The Family Tree. What's it been like for you having your second book out?
I'll be completely honest, it's been quite a struggle, and just because you've done something once doesn't mean the second time round it's going to be any easier. That's something that I've learned. I've also learned that it's true what they say about the second novel syndrome. It is hard. It's really, really tough. I think with the first book, you write it without any expectations. There's no guarantee anyone's going to read it apart from your mum. And, you're just writing without any expectation of any applause. It's something that you feel like you have to do. So this time around, when I've actually signed a contract, I've put my name on the dotted line, I need to come up with something else. I really felt the pressure. And as I was writing Hidden Fires, The Family Tree, it was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award, the Portico Prize. So all of that amazing stuff was happening. So the pressure was like doubling. But, we've got there, and I'm really proud of this book. And I just hope that people love it as much as, as they did The Family Tree.
So, I mean, I certainly loved it. And I think anyone that picks it up definitely will as well. There's just so much, it's so rich. And you've spoken about that sort of second novel syndrome. I know that the publishing industry is just this ever morphing kind of beast. It keeps on changing. It's influenced by social media massively. So I wonder if there were external pressures for you, not just in knowing that you've got a deadline and you've got a book, but in terms of other things that maybe, I don't know, in terms of trends or buzzwords or those kind of things. Did anything like that influence you along the way as well?
I think that's one good thing that's one thing I'm good at doing, is blocking out all of that noise. Because with the family tree, I was kind of trying to go against the grain anyway, with the fact that I was trying to write this counter narrative, this story with Muslim characters that wasn't about them being Muslim. So I'd kind of studied around, what was already out there. So I knew what I didn't want to do. And I think, if anything, in terms of trends, something that did influence me was the older protagonist, which I'd seen in, Saving Missy, Elizabeth is Missing, Three Things About Elsie. So I loved that aspect. I loved that kind of interest into an elderly person's life. But again, what I was going to do and what I was trying to do was write from the viewpoint of an elderly Asian man. And that's something that I couldn't find anywhere. I don't think I'm sure it probably has been done, but I certainly, in my research, haven't come across this type of character. But otherwise, I do tend to I know what I'm going to do, and I also know what I'm not going to do, because of this constant flood of, stereotypical stories about Muslims, Asian people of colour in general. So, I don't tend to get influenced as much with what's going on and what's cool and what's trendy. I just sort of do my own thing. Yeah.
No, that's really great, because I remember speaking to Leila Abu Leila at one point, and she said to me that because she's been writing since the 90s, so she's witnessed almost that over 30 years of the publishing industry and all the change that's come with that, and she's published so many books. And she said that in the 90s, you just had a book out in the world and that was it. You don't really have to do much promotion. You didn't have to be a personality. You didn't have to make yourself available. And then she said, and there wasn't even really a trend to have a bestseller, because it was so elite. It was kind of if your books were out there in the world and people didn't know, that was more a sign of success. If you had a really popular book, it kind of meant that, it was a little bit trashy almost.
Oh,
and
wow.
I found that so interesting, because, and it kind of makes sense if we think about elitism, elite things are very, they're just for a specific group of people, or a very small number of people. But now I guess the thing is you want to get your book out to as many people as possible. And it's just interesting thinking about the way that things are different. And I'm glad that at least that elitism has changed, because obviously I think in certain, it's still there, but it's changed in the sense that we want people to access as many books as possible. And when somebody is writing a book, they're trying to think about trying to reach out to a wide group of people or a wide number of people, and it really changes things. And actually, on the elderly male protagonist, I really love stories with elderly people, but they always make me so sad, even if they're really happy. And I think the only other one I read with an Asian male protagonist is, Sarah Nisha Adams, The Reading List.
Yes.
But her protagonist, he's not Muslim. And Sarah does this very she has very gentle, in a similar way to you, very gentle representation. So, we know he's an Indian man, but that's kind of where it stops. And so obviously you explore something completely different, because we have the faith element of it. I think that's probably the only other one I've seen. I think it allows you to explore so much more.
Yeah.
So just to begin with,
I was sent a proof of that novel, and I think it was called The Reading List, and it is brilliant.
Yeah. Really, really good. I really love that. But just to begin with, why don't you take a moment just to introduce Hidden Fighters? Tell our listeners what it's about.
So I think at the heart of it, because like you said, there is a lot going on. There's a lot that I explore in the novel, but at the heart of this book is an unlikely friendship story between a grandfather and his granddaughter. And, they're very different from each other. That bond, grandfather, granddaughter, at the beginning of the book, it's kind of only in name. They don't really know each other that well. So he's an elderly Asian gentleman. He's widowed. He lives in Bradford on his own. And she's a biracial teenager 16-year-old from Manchester, and she spends most of her time doing makeup videos, makeup tutorials on YouTube and listening to 80s music. That's how she spends her time. So these two characters, they wouldn't normally choose to spend time together. But, there's a twist of fate and they do end up having to spend time together quite closely. She has to go and live with her grandpa. So, I forgot to say her name. Her name's Ruby. She's called Ruby, and her granddad is Yusuf. So Ruby goes and she has to live with Yusuf for a few weeks while her parents are away. And the book sort of follows their bond and, how it starts to how, it's kind of like finding connection in the most unexpected places. And both of them have their own thing going on. They've got their own sort of trauma that they've buried deep. Yusuf is sort of in the early stages of dementia, very early stages, and he's getting these sort of violent flashbacks from his childhood, which we later find out that it is his experiences of the Partition of India. He was only 10 years old when this happened. So these flashbacks that he's getting are from the partition. And Ruby has her own problems that any 16-year-old would have in this day and age, bullying, social media, just that sort of, that sort of ruin that. I would say, again, we don't know whether we have more mental health problems now as a people or if we're just talking about them not more. But, she's struggling with her mental health, and so she has her own sort of issues that she's dealing with. And it's, these two characters, and it's how they connect and just how their bond develops whilst they explore each other and their relationship, their family history, but also their own little traumas that they're trying to cope with.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't waffle too much.
No,
it's always a difficult question.
Yeah, definitely. But no, you didn't. And as I said, I absolutely loved it because I loved the fact that we had two different characters who were going through so much individually, kind of hiding those things from one another, but also everybody else. So there was like this middle character who is Yusuf's son, who was like this like thread between the grandfather and the granddaughter. And he's also trying to have a good relationship with his own father. And he's got things going on, with his wife and his mother-in-law and all this kind of stuff. And so he's the bridge. But actually, when we delve into it, we see that like he also doesn't have the relationship with his daughter that he should have, and he doesn't have the relationship with his father that he should have. But somehow, just by him being who he is, he brings these two characters together. It's it's something that happens in his life that means that Ruby has to come and stay with his grandfather. There's nowhere else that she can go. And that was also very interesting because, we see this sort of like fraught relationship between Ruby and her father and, Yusuf and her son. The most important relationship obviously is between Yusuf and his granddaughter. I haven't seen too many stories that look at that grandfather or grandparent and granddaughter story. And it was like, I just thought it was so beautifully done and so raw, because there is a huge amount of like a lack of understanding, at least initially, between different generations. And we see it with Ruby. She's like frustrated because she wants to go and hang out with her friends after her exams. But, her grandfather, he wants her home because it's Eid. And, she's like irritated by him getting up early in the morning. But, he's an elderly man and he's got his own routine. And we see that frustration, and then we see it kind of develop into a deeper understanding. But what were you really interested in bringing out about that intergenerational relationship? Like what were some of the things that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I think I did this a little bit with the family tree with Ami and Zara.
Yeah.
Very slightly. And it's definitely something that I wanted to explore further. And obviously, I can't lie, this book is inspired by my relationship with my grandparents. And, I think, there is that generation, for all of us, there's that generational difference with a grandparent and a grandchild. Of course there is. I feel with us and our community that, like, we come from, it's even more so. My grandparents, and I'm assuming your grandparents as well, will have been probably born in another country.
Yeah.
You know, my grandmothers, both of them, couldn't read. They can't read and they can't write. So, you know, they had a very, very basic village education. They can't read and they can't write. So skip 2 generations and then you've got me. And when I published The Family Tree, I sent my book to Pakistan, to my grandma and granddad there. And it's written in English, so, but even so, you know, what they were doing was, and my grandma here as well, you know, they were just sort of they kept picking it up and flicking through it.
Aww.
And they kept flicking through it and looking at it. And it really broke my heart that they can't read it.
Yeah.
You know, we are very different to each other. Me, my sister, my cousins, to our grandparents. But the love that we have and the bond that we have is, for me especially, probably the strongest relationships I've ever had are with my grandparents. The people I love the most in this whole world are my grandparents. And, you know, I guess that's what I wanted to explore. You know, how can you be so different from each other, but you just love each other and absolutely adore each other so much? You know, how can that translate? You know, how does that cross over? So much difference, but it's there. So I think that's what I wanted to explore. And also and I'm, you know, sure we'll talk about this later, but just my grandparents' generation. So, you know, my grandma and granddad, my maternal grandma and granddad came over here in the 60s. I mean, the lives that they've led are just absolutely fascinating. So my grandma was too young to remember partition, but my granddad, who sadly passed away, I was only 12 when he passed away, but I do know that he was a child during the partition. I wasn't interested in partition before the age of 12, so I never asked him about it. I mean, even if he was here now, would I be brave enough to ask him about it? I don't know. But, you know, so having gone through that and survived that, and then uprooting and moving to a different country and, you know, starting a whole new life here, and look at what that has led to, you know, different generations. I mean, and adjusting to that, I just think not enough is made of that. Not enough is spoken about what they did for us. It's just fascinating and just heroic, really.
Yeah.
And I think it just needs to be explored further and documented further.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, like, so, I mean, I think I felt really sad a lot of the time reading your book, just because I don't have any living grandparents now. And my maternal grandmother, she passed away when I was, not that long ago, 2014. She passed away in 2014. And, but she had Alzheimer's. So like for a good few years before, she, you know, kind of like was losing her memory. So I didn't really get a chance to spend a huge amount of time with her. And, you know, she didn't know who I was a lot of the time. But my paternal grandmother passed away like a good few years before, and she lived in Pakistan, so I hardly saw her. And my maternal grandfather, he passed away. I was very young. I was like 5 or 6. And my paternal grandfather, I never met him. He passed away when my father was very young. My father was only 8 years old. So I don't have such a bond. And I know like you've written about your bond with your grandparents before as well. And I always look at people that have those relationships, and I really feel a pang of that sort of like loss almost, because you know
that is a grief in itself, isn't it?
Absolutely. And especially I think now when I think about how much about the world and history we don't know, and actually is in the memories of those people. Some of them are not around anymore, but some of them are still suffering with grief so much that they can't even talk about it. And they haven't been given the spaces to heal and to talk about it. But that's so much of that history, unfortunately, because it has all been whitewashed and purposefully left out of history records, actually how important it is for us to try and understand exactly what happened. Because I think a lot of us growing up have this understanding that there's a part of our own history that we don't know and we don't understand. And I think growing up in the West it feels very alienating from yourself to not really know like where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And we see that with Ruby, like there's always something a little bit amiss with her, because she not only is her grandfather clearly dealing with something so traumatic and she has no idea, but she herself, she's mixed race, she's biracial. So I don't know, you seem to explore lots of different complexities in identity. Why did you decide to add a further layer of complexity to Ruby's character and have her have a mixed race identity? And you know, I think because there was a little bit of a contrast between her grandparents, and maybe that was part of the reason. But yeah, why did you decide to include a mixed race character? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have. I love Ruby. I think she's great. But yeah, but like, why did you think that was? What do you think that was going to do to the story you were trying to tell?
Well, I'm just going to be honest. This was a technical decision.
Oh,
it was because I needed to get her parents out of there for long enough. Yeah, I'm just going to be honest. I needed to get them out of there long enough so she could stay with her granddad. And I needed... Now, if there had been a death in Pakistan, Hassan probably could have gone on his own. Or... You know, because there'd be, or like Michelle, whatever her name would be, could have gone on his own because there'd be loads of family there to help with the funeral. So I was like, okay, they need to go elsewhere. And I was actually working with a colleague who a similar situation had happened where her mother-in-law had passed away in Barbados. And I was like, oh, okay. So initially, Ruby's grandmother was in Barbados and had to go to Barbados. But then when I was researching sort of funerals and what happens and the legalities of all the, you know, I thought, right, okay, we'll stick to Spain. That's more straightforward. So it did start off, I'll be honest, with a bit of a technical, you know, I needed both parents out of there for, you know, a certain number of weeks. And it just wouldn't have been realistic to have them go off back home to Pakistan or wherever. But then from my own family, it was very easy for me to write this character because, you know, my auntie and uncle, my uncle married a white lady called my Auntie Sarah, and they've got mixed race children, obviously. So that has been in my family. And I've listened to their story. And I said to him, I hope you don't sue me because I've borrowed quite a lot from your little love story. But so it wasn't something that I was writing from no experience whatsoever. With Ruby, though, I think there is that, you're absolutely right. It's just worked out so well because there is that added layer of difference between her and her grandfather. But what I tried to do was not dwell on that too much because I think Ruby could just be any teenager, you know, a mixed race or not mixed race, and she'd still find her granddad very different to her. What I also didn't want to do was have Ruby discover the Asian part of her identity now that she's, you know, had developed this relationship with Yusuf. I didn't want it to be that novel where she's embarrassed of that side of the family, but suddenly now that she's, you know, she's found her religion and she's found her culture through Yusuf, I kind of I tried to make her a bit indifferent to all of that because I wanted the focus to be on their bond, on their relationship, grandfather, granddaughter. I didn't want it to be like a finding, you know, Ruby finding herself. She finds herself, but in a completely different way. She doesn't find her religion and she doesn't find her culture. Maybe, obviously, it's natural that she would sort of become more comfortable in her skin and with who she is. But I didn't want to put too much focus on the racial element. I don't know how successful I've been at that. Maybe that's something you could...
Well, I think just the the nature of the story you're telling, I think it's very difficult to not have a focus on like racial identity and religious identity, and it would have felt really strange if Ruby didn't develop in that way and didn't have thoughts on that. But I don't think it was like overkill, and I certainly don't think that this process that what she went through has like made her more in tune with her Pakistani identity. I think fundamentally it gave her the most beautiful relationship with her grandfather. Like that's what that time really achieved, and it wasn't because she learned about Pakistani food or Muslim and like Islam and praying 5 times a day. It was because she learned who her grandfather is, and she saw him being vulnerable, and she saw him, dealing with his past, and she was in his life and in his space. So I think definitely that's what really really comes across. But I love that, as with the family tree, just like the complexity that you give us about identity, that it's not just one thing, and that like any one person is dealing with like so many different parts, so many conflicting parts of that identity, whether you're biracial or whether your parents are from the same place. Especially when you're living in the UK, you're also dealing with like so much outside noise, let alone what's just like going on within you and within your family.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you. No, that's so true. And I guess because when I was writing the family tree, I wanted, because of this, the focus, the way in which identity has been explored, it's always like, well, we start off here, and by the end of the novel, the characters will have assimilated, and they won't feel this, I'm straddling 2 cultures, I don't know who I am. When we meet the characters in the family tree, for me, as personally, their assimilation is complete.
Yeah.
They're already assimilated. They are who they are. They're comfortable with who they are. What happens to them, but it's not the focus of the novel. I guess I try to do, something similar with this novel. But yeah, that focus on Ruby's identity and learning about her Pakistani heritage and the partition, that's, of course, that would, that's natural. That had to happen. Yeah. But not. I'm glad you think it was subtle and not sort of in your face.
Yeah, because Ruby. So Ruby is she's a teenager, and I mean she's really struggling with her identity, but not in this like, am I British or am I Pakistani or part Pakistani? Like that's not her struggle. Her struggle is that she's a teenager. She's different in character and personality, in the way that she dresses, in her music choices, in the way that she looks, and she's just struggling to feel accepted and loved and loving herself. Now that could be any teenager from any background living in any part of the UK with any kind of parents. Like it could be anyone. It's such a, like in some ways, although it's a very specific story, it's a very universal experience, I think, as a teenager, when you're no longer that sort of very dependent child. You're having your own thoughts and your own ideas, and you are seeing in front of you, the possibility of a life, and friendship means a little bit more to you than it used to when you were a child, and you start to think about the world in different ways. And I think like you captured that so well, that kind of like fraught, like that tension you have in just trying to be, and just within yourself. And like I said, like she could have been from any background, and it would have still probably been a very similar experience. But obviously Ruby is dealing with some real mental health issues, and she resorts to really sort of unhealthy and harmful behavior and trying to deal with some of the pain that she's going through. What was it like for you exploring that? Like what research did you go in? Like, did you go into for that? And why did you decide to have so much like anguish?
I think, there's multiple reasons. I think with this generational storyline, it is a thing where the older generations have been through so much, and their lack of understanding at times for the younger generations, like okay, why are you sad? You have food on the table. You have a roof over your head. You have opportunities that we could only have dreamt of. Why? What is wrong with you? Why are you sad? But the problem is that we are seeing a generational thing where young people are sad. Ruby is sad. Yeah. There is something wrong. So, we have to deal with that. And, sometimes, older people, the kind of approach is, things that we're trying to move away from now. So like telling young people to get a grip or we just got on with it. These are all things that are very real, and these are conversations that are taking place in so many households. I teach at university. I deal with, I'm in contact with young people, 18, 19-year-olds. And we are seeing, we have a wellbeing centre at the university, access to mental health services. We are seeing, it feels unprecedented. And I'm a newbie, as in I'm just starting out. But, so my colleagues who are older have been doing this for like nearly 20 years. They feel that it's unprecedented, the amount of referrals we are having to make to the mental health services. There's so many, it's not just depression, it's anxiety, there's so many problems, and it makes me really sad. Yeah. I want everyone to just be happy, obviously, but I want my students to just be happy. They're young. You want them to be living their best lives, but unfortunately it seems that they're not. And that's what I wanted. I did want to explore that. Again, I think it would just have been half a story had I not explored that with this generational, intergenerational struggle, if you like. But then sort of comparing that to what Yusuf has gone through, Ruby's problems do pale in comparison, of course. But, everything is relative, and there is still that attempt by Yusuf to understand. Research-wise, of course, like my interactions, at my work, but my other uncle, you see, this is why I was saying I hope my family don't sue me. My other uncle is a social worker, very high up, and he works in child protection, so I had just this unlimited source research, constantly ringing him up and knocking on his door and asking, what would happen in this situation, what would happen in that situation. So I was very lucky in that way. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers what you asked me.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because what we see in Yusuf is this inability to talk about what happened, but we also see it in Ruby. And so although they are decades apart in terms of almost like the start of the trauma, it's still very difficult for Ruby to find the words and find the space to talk about what she's going through. And actually, it's interesting to see that side by side, because, we say that, maybe we're talking about mental health more and maybe we're having these open spaces, but actually it's still really difficult. Yeah. And so it's really sort of it's interesting to see it side by side, to also think if it's difficult for a character like Ruby, who can probably pop into a wellbeing service at her school, can probably speak to teachers. Her father is also a social worker in the book, like your uncle, but she has access to these things. If it's so difficult for her, exactly how difficult must it have been for Yusuf all of these years? And look at the way that it's coming out now, when he's this sort of much more fragile older man living by himself, and just sort of having that as a just side by side reading it is it makes you think. I'd say there's something quite alarming about that, but it's very interesting to think about and to understand. I think to really force us to think about the ways in which we aren't talking about what's going on, but the need to really do that.
Absolutely. And I think if Ruby can be saved now, then all these issues, they won't manifest later in life, and that generation. And I chose not to sort of do that with Yusuf because he's my protagonist. He's not perfect. He's very closed off. He's flawed. But talking to people, that generation could be quite volatile.
Yeah.
abusive, and it's not, and we have to be honest about that, with their wives, with their children. But why? Where has that come from? What, and that's the thing. These things, if they're not addressed and they're not spoken about, absolute horrors that generation witnessed, it's going to come out. It's going to come out, and it could potentially ruin other lives, not just that individuals. So yeah, I suppose the book is making that point that, keeping things locked away and repressed, it's not the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Yusuf's almost like the secret, or like his past that he's really grappling with, obviously is, as you mentioned, is based on the partition of India and what he went through on a personal level, like what he saw literally happen right in front of him, but also obviously what he saw happen to people around him. And he makes reference, his friend that lives near him also, and he asks his friend at one point, do you remember, and do you dream about it? And so it is about the partition of India. Now, I am really pleased to see the way in which we're talking about what happened more now. There seems to be more literature available, more work is being done to really sort of bring out the truth. Why did you decide to focus on the partition of India? And what was your process like? Because you've told a very specific story that's actually very harrowing. Where did the details of that come from? Because, it's the first time I'd heard of that specific one, but I've heard of terrible, terrible stories and terrible, terrible experiences, but not that specific one.
Without giving away spoilers then, is the specific one you're mentioning what happened to Yusuf or what happened to his friend?
What happened to Yusuf?
Okay. I did check to see, have I gone a bit extra here with this? And unfortunately, I haven't. The things that I read about were even worse, which is just terrible, devastating. So I'll start with the first bit. Why the partition? So I've always had this interest in the partition. I know, and I've got people saying to me now as they're reading the book that I did, and from my background, saying I didn't even know this was a thing. I didn't know about it. But how would you know about it? Because family's not talking about it. That's the unspoken rule. We don't talk about partition. It's too painful. And it's not just because what happened was terrible, but everyone was a villain in this story, almost. All sides committed the most monstrous acts against each other. So there's no, like in other conflicts, it's sometimes easier to say, okay, well, so the Nazis, you were the bad guys. In another conflict, you can pinpoint who were the bad guys. You can't really do that. You could say it was the British. Yeah, that's probably accurate. But then the horrors that were inflicted were committed by Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs against each other. Yeah. So you don't really know what your family did to another family. The thought of it is quite, it's something you just want to kind of push out of your head straight away. It's something that's really difficult to even think about. So I had this interest. So my first introduction to partition was watching the movie, a Bollywood movie called Gadar, which has really good songs in it. And yeah, I think it's kind of like the millennial. As I was doing my research, it's kind of like the millennial introduction to the partition was watching Gadar. And yeah, it kind of explored the aftermath of the partition, where there was two people from different sides of the religious divide who met, fell in love, but then her family found her and tried to get her to go back to Pakistan, and she didn't want to leave her husband, who was Sikh, behind. But I found, and when I rewatched that film later, it's very anti-Pakistan, very sort of propaganda, and if Pakistan had a big, massive, thriving film industry at the time, I'm sure they'd be doing exactly the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
So that was kind of like my introduction. That this thing happened. I didn't realise that India and Pakistan were one country, and then the British were there, right? Okay, so that was my introduction to it. of course, it is not taught in schools. I've heard it is now because I have a cousin who's 13 and she told me that they have been learning about the partition, but that's after a lot of campaigning to get it onto the curriculum. So for 70 years prior, it's been deliberately obscured from the textbooks, as have all British colonial atrocities. You know, we don't talk about them. We'd rather focus on other countries and all the bad things that they did, not our own. So yeah, generally, how would you know about partition if you're not being taught about it at school and family's not talking about it? So my interest in the partition sort of started there, and I've kind of dipped in and out throughout the years. So throughout my teenage years, I'd become obsessed with it, read everything there was about it, and then so kind of, you know, be horrified and then leave and then come back. So I did my literature dissertation on it, on partition literature. I watched every time there's been anniversaries and they've put documentaries on the BBC. I've watched them all. So my knowledge of it was already quite good, you know. And I guess my interest is, you know, from that personal connection because I am Pakistani. But there was so much about it that troubled me. So much. And, you know, I mean, I could talk about this all day, so I'll try and keep it brief. But, you know, the fact that why did we act in the way that we did?
Yeah.
You know, and my sort of young teenage brain didn't have access to those resources to understand that. So my issue was we turned into the savages that the British, said we were. Look at how we reacted. As soon as they left, look at what we did to each other. And again, I didn't have access to the sort of literature at the time to understand the complexities of why that happened and why decolonisation, as Frantz Fanon said, is always a violent event. The other thing that troubled me was, you know, the Muhammad Ali Jinnah, so who created Pakistan, who advocated for a separate state for Muslims. Why did that happen? Again, it was almost, he's always been sort of portrayed as this villain of partition, you know, the troublemaker. And that troubled me. It was like, okay, why were the Muslims being troublemakers? Why did they want a separate state? Why didn't they just want to live happily ever after once the British had left? Again, I didn't understand at the time that they were, you know, they were going to be at the mercy of an absolutely overwhelming Hindu majority. And the British had already sort of started trying to play them off against each other, the different religious factions. So anyway, all of these things have troubled me throughout the years. I've, you know, definitely, it has been an ambition of mine to write a partition novel. But when it came to it all just sort of happened at the right time because 2017, I went down to meet my publisher for the first time to, you know, talk about the family tree. The first question they asked me was, are you writing another book? And I was like, yeah, of course I am, you know. So I had a few sort of sleepless nights, you know, in the months that followed. This was just after the Grenfell Tower fire during Ramadan. I went to meet my publisher a couple of weeks later after Ramadan. And it was August of that year that it was the 70th anniversary of the partition. So all these documentaries started coming on the BBC and I jumped straight in again. And that's where I kind of refound it, and I thought, right, now is the moment. The time's come, and I'm gonna do this thing. But my approach to it, that was the challenge for me. How am I going to approach this? Because the partition sort of films and literature that I've encountered, you know, there's some scenarios that have been repeated. Star-crossed lovers, obviously, you know, different religious factions, you know, then being torn apart by the violence. Friends, so like Bapsi Sidhwa's as Candyman, friends from the different religious factions who absolutely love each other, but they turn on each other. The relationships just totally disintegrate. And then also the politics of it. So, you know, big movies like Gandhi or Viceroy's House, which focus on certain historical figures and the politics. You know, you've got the servant sort of earwig in whilst, you know, the big decisions are being made in you know, important rooms. Well, that's not the approach I wanted to take. I did want to focus on the legacy. And it was watching those documentaries and seeing those elderly men talking, sometimes for the first time, about partition and the emotion that just poured from them. I've never seen anything so it was so moving. It was so moving. And that's where I found Yusuf, and that's where I decided to write the book.
Yeah.
Sorry, information dump.
No, I mean, that was just so really beautiful, I think, in many ways, hearing you talk about it like that, because you're right. I mean, there are still many people that don't even know that it happened. And then that partition even happened, that India and Pakistan were one country, and then to understand what happened and why it happened, I think, to be honest, is something that we will probably be continually learning about, simply because there has been such an effort, as you said, to just not talk about it and to silence the truth from all sides, and for different reasons, because people don't want to talk about it because of their own trauma and facing also the guilt of what it was that they were party to, or sometimes what they even did themselves. But the other side of it is that Britain have been evading responsibility for over 75 years and not acknowledging and not really, taking responsibility for the fact that not only did they draw the line of partition and enforce partition, but everything they did in the years and the decades that led up to that, which was divisive, which was harmful, which was violent, even while they were still there. And I think that shift is coming. We're seeing this call for the decolonizing of the school curriculum, of literature, and we're seeing more interest in just having these different stories being told. But I think it is something slow. I feel like I read partition literature a lot, and I feel like I need to, because I need to keep learning. And I'm amazed at how much more I'm learning every time I pick up something, a different kind of story, a different perspective, a different detail that I didn't know before, a different layer or something that I didn't quite get. And I think that for so many of us, that like this is going to be this thing that we're continually learning for so long, because also there's not like one source where like everything is available. Like things are surfacing, and like as you said before as well, like we are losing the generation that lived through it. Like they are passing away because they're elderly. Like they're passing away, and it's more important than ever that we capture those stories. And even if we don't capture everything, just to understand the different things that people went through, the different experiences, and the myriad of ways that people were impacted. So obviously you told Yusuf's story, and then you also told the story of his friend, which was also very harrowing, very different.
Have you heard that story before?
Yes, I hadn't heard the specific one of Yusuf's story, but I had heard the friend story. I've heard that in different ways.
Yes, and that I think...
Yeah, I've heard that in different ways, yeah.
I've heard that one time is too many. It comes up a lot.
It's interesting. Yeah, well, because one was about something that was done to Yusuf's brother right in front of him and also to him, and then the other is about not only what people did to other people, but what they had to do to themselves and their loved ones to protect themselves, or what they thought they were doing to protect themselves, because just knowing that the alternative would be so awful that in that case, maybe this is a spoiler, but in that case, like, death is more dignified than some of the violence that could have ensued.
And you've put it so beautifully, since you're talking about something so harrowing, but you've said it so well, because I even feel like that has been hijacked, the telling of that story, in the sense that it's often framed in a way that, well, these men, these fathers, they couldn't have this being happened to their women, and their honour was more important, so they had to, kill them. Sorry, I had to do the spoiler there, because it kind of makes sense. It's kind of framed like that. And again, it's like, okay, have you considered that they may have loved their daughters?
Exactly.
They may have loved their wives and their sisters. Again, it's just that, it's that sort of Orientalism rearing its ugly head, Muslim men or men of colour, whoever, because this was happening across the religious divides, are just incapable of, having any kind of love and affection for their female relatives, that they would do that. And even that, absolutely horrendous act was done for their own benefit, rather than, as you just said, that there was actually more dignity in death, and the alternative was just much more horrifying.
Yeah.
So even the stories that are being told are often sort of framed in a certain way that has troubled me.
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously, like, there was violence, and I feel like Partition brought out the most ugly side of everybody. This like animalistic nature, or like Thomas Hobbes, right? He wrote the Leviathan, and he said, like, the fundamental thing is that every human has the ability to kill another human, and every person is vulnerable to death at the very least because we all sleep. So this idea that anybody can kill somebody else in their sleep, right? Like, no matter how good you are at defending yourself, at one point you will be asleep. And I think about, I don't like his politics and his philosophy at all, but I studied it at university, which is why I remember it. But I think about that a lot. And I think if you are pushed to your absolute limit, what is it that you are capable of doing? But it's not just about that. Like, it's so complex what you are capable of doing and what you are forced to do for the different things that matter to you, and the different values that you hold, and the different relationships you have, and the way that you love people, but also what you believe about this world and what you believe about the hereafter as well, I think makes a difference as well. Like, I think when you have ideas of being held to account for your actions by God or by a higher power, whatever it may be with your religious tendency, I think that also impacts sometimes what you believe about the actions that you're doing. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to get into a debate about what you believe about the hereafter. But I was so, obviously, like, you told really harrowing stories, very moving, but in a way that was very dignified. And like what came across was like the pain and the grief and the the sadness and the loss of all of that. And I just want to like commend you on the way that you brought it forward as well, because these stories are important, and we can't just force ourselves to hide away from it. I think we have a duty to understand what has happened around the world in order to understand what is happening now. We're living in a time that's absolutely terrible, and what we're witnessing, especially, in Gaza, it's not in isolation. And if we're able to understand things that have happened before and things that are happening right now around the world, I think it can help give some sort of, I don't know, context or understanding. Which is important.
Sorry, carry on. Sorry,
no, go on.
I'll be honest. I've been asked multiple times in interviews now, why the partition? Why is it important? And I found myself saying things. Well, we should know about the past so we can understand what's happening now, the future, so it doesn't happen again. And I feel I've really struggled with it. I really struggled. And there have been moments in the lead up to publication and after publication where I have thought, what was the point of this? What was the point? Because, why should people care about a 75-year-old hideous event that happened when we don't care? Especially the people in power don't care about what's happening now. It's really difficult to sort of accept that and come to terms with it, publishing in this landscape at the moment. And it's also kind of shown that Britain, you can't sort of say, well, this happened, we were colonisers back then. When we have reared our ugly sort of colonial mindset and heads right now. We're sort of, with the situation in Gaza, we're blocking, attempts at ceasefires. We're funding, we're arming a genocide. So, and it has made me really depressed. It has, because I've thought, generally, people write about atrocities of the past, and the whole purpose of doing that is because you don't want these things to happen again, and we should know about the past. Never again, all of that. But it is happening again. It's happening right now. And the people in power, are just behaving as we would expect them to behave. And you just think, actually, there is no hope for humanity. We are bad and we're never going to be good. Yeah. And that's that. That's the kind of things that I've struggled with. I've been thinking, well, that's that. But then at the same time, you can't be that hopeless. You just can't be. And you look around and you think, no, well, actually, no, the people are good. The people are marching every single day. Every Saturday since October, they've been marching. They're boycotting. They're doing everything, raising awareness, amplifying, donating. They're doing all of these things. And you have to kind of hold on to that, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel your frustration, about that, like, oh, we learn from the past, so we understand now, so never again. I actually don't. I don't really believe. I don't believe that, because who's doing the learning? The learning is happening by the people, right? And the harsh reality is that there are people in power who are not interested in the books that you're writing or the books that I'm reading, or they're not listening to my podcast. They're not, they're not trying to. They know what their predecessors and government have already done. They already know that. But who's doing the learning? It's people. It's masses and masses of people. And although we can say never again, fundamentally, I think we kind of know it's not fully in our hands. But if we inform ourselves, if we equip ourselves with enough knowledge and enough understanding, what we can do is we can do whatever it is that we can do, right? I think the shift in public opinion, in public narrative, in pressure that is going on the government, going on mainstream media, I think that is what matters. It's the lobby, isn't it? It's the public lobby. It's the opposition. It's the activist movement. It's the liberation movement. It's that we can strengthen by informing ourselves and educating ourselves. And we only, and I think knowing that what is happening right now in Gaza is not happening in isolation, even right now. No. Obviously, our government is bombing Yemen. There's awful things happening in Sudan, in Congo, all of these things. Like, we know these things. This is not happening in isolation. But also, this October 7th was not the start of a war. This has been over 70 years of occupation. And so, to understand that, I think is integral to being able to strengthen the movement, to call on those that are making the decisions and forcing them to do something else to the best of our ability. I think to a certain extent, maybe we have to accept that maybe every single march or whatever it is that we're doing, maybe it will not get the result. But can you imagine if we lived in a world where that wasn't happening? Can you imagine just existing in a world where Exactly. Yeah. Where people don't know the reality or don't know the history. Living in a world where we're just we have this bizarre notion of what is happening right now. It feels like that is actually very scary to think about that to allow ourselves almost to become sheep or quiet or whatever it might be. And I think there is so much hope and so much sort of comfort to the heart in knowing that so many people are, as you said, taking to the streets every weekend. Yeah. It's been raining and snowing and windy in this country for the last few months, and people have been taking to the streets every weekend. On
every continent. It's
exactly. Yeah. So obviously, this was a very heavy book for you to write, and I mean, as was The Family Tree, but I think for very different reasons. But this, I think, was very heavy for you to write. And not only are you dealing with a partition story, but you're also, Ruby's mental health conditions, and then all the relationships between grandfather, granddaughter, father, son, father, daughter. Yeah. Those are not those are not easy things to even think about or to talk about or to write about. And you capture emotions so beautifully. You have such a distinct storytelling style, which I love. But how did you also look after yourself during that process? Because I'm assuming you had to go to some really dark places to bring out some of that, because you know what? I really felt like, and I told you this when I read The Family Tree, like, you know, the opening scene with Amjad, I felt his grief literally like just came out of the pages of the book. Like I really felt it. And I felt the same with Yusuf as he's telling his story and he's calling out to his brother. I felt that pain. And that's me as a reader. I didn't even write those words. So how did you sort of navigate that, and how did you look after yourself during the process?
It's really funny because, so first of all, I found that I found this with The Family Tree. I can't watch violent movies. I have to check the parents' guide. I can't take it. I don't like it. But writing about like the scene of the attack in The Family Tree, that was okay. I was okay with that. And I think with this book, it's funny because you're kind of so isolated when you're writing, and it's not until you hear other people's responses that you think, wow. Because somebody said to me, one of the first readers that I did an interview with a bookseller, and the lady, Alice, she said to me, this is a really political book. Whereas I'd spent the whole time writing it thinking, no, this isn't a political book. The Family Tree was political because Zara was all into her politics. This isn't. She went, I said, oh, really? Do you think so? She went, well, you're talking about the partition. You're talking about Grenfell. You start off with Grenfell. You know, this is a political... And I was like, yeah, actually. It kind of, actually, it is a political book. Yeah. But just because my characters were interested in politics in that sense, I mean, Ruby develops this interest in, history. But it's not until other people's responses that you think, so as you've just said, this is a really heavy book to write. I definitely felt that there were scenes, obvious ones to you that you've read it, that, I took a deep breath and I went there. On the flip side to that, I feel like this is a much funnier book. I know we've been so deep during this conversation, but trust me, I think it's quite hilarious. I still flick through it, and there's bits that I laugh out loud at. Maybe that's just me laughing at my own jokes. But, other people have sent me pictures, friends, that, oh, this is so funny. And I think I hope that I found this balance with this book. Yusuf and Ruby's sort of antics as they're trying to adjust to each other, I think is really funny, and it's really light-hearted to read. And I find Ruby's voice, I think Ruby saved me in this book, because, and I have had the odd comment saying, review saying, oh, this sounds like an adult trying to be cool and trying to be a teenager, and it's cringe, and sorry about that. I tried my best. On the flip side, some people have said, I think this is so authentic. This sounds just like my teenager. How did you manage that? So yeah, it depends. Everybody's got their own sort of opinion. But I think Ruby's sort of attitude, that teenager, that youthfulness, I really enjoyed writing from her perspective, in the sense that, it kind of lifts you up to, I don't know, I felt lifted when I was writing her, because it's almost conversational, and it's like even with a young person, something really serious can happen, but they can find the humour in it. And that's what I felt like writing Ruby's perspectives, and obviously it alternates between her son's, much more serious chapters and Yusuf's. But Ruby kind of provided this sort of light relief to me throughout, even though, she's dealing with difficult things. But, how did I look after myself? You just do, don't you? You just have to, I don't know, as writers, I did cry while writing the book, and that was helpful. And that maybe sounds a bit egotistical. Oh, I cried reading my own words and writing my own words. But it wasn't me. It was just the research and the things that I'm not writing. Yes, I'm writing fiction, but these things actually happened. So it felt very real.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I had some laughs and I had some crying sessions, and it got me through it.
It's interesting because the family tree had an incident, had an actual incident that obviously changed the course of the lives of all our characters, and it was very, very traumatic and very sad and big, huge. The Hidden Fires there wasn't an incident as such. I mean, obviously we have Yusuf's worsening dementia. Okay, that's not a spoiler. We have his worsening, his worsening dementia, which brings to the surface some of the stuff. And actually, I guess the incident is something that happened. It is a memory, isn't it? It's a flashback. It's not actually something that happens in the plot at the time. But it was still. So I guess from that perspective, maybe it's less shocking in terms of the plot, because there's not that peak in the plot as we see it on the page. And I thought that, especially the scene where Ruby and Yusuf are cooking, that I think is my favorite scene, because it was very funny, it was very cute, and he's just like, oh, for God's sake, just go away, it's not working. It was very sweet, very wholesome, and it's funny because it's just that both of their personalities were just so loud in that scene, and they both kind of make this one curry, and it's but it's coming at it from two completely different perspectives. I really loved it, and I just felt like that is what that's the crux of the relationship, isn't it? Is that two people stuck trying to make this relationship between them work. And I also find it interesting that someone that calls a book like this political, almost as if it's a choice. And I think the reality is that when your own identity and your history is political, that's not a choice you're making.
No.
I feel sometimes people tell me all the time, you're so political, I'm just but this is my life. I'm not doing it on purpose. I'm not being controversial. I'm not bringing politics into I'm not forcing it into the things that I'm saying or the things that I'm feeling. This is my life. I can't really do anything about that.
Absolutely.
And it's just interesting to have that, to be labeled in that way. It's just
That's so true. That is so true. Yeah. I mean, I think, and with going back there, but with the situation in Gaza, I mean, do you have a choice to speak out about that? Because I certainly don't. Other people do, and I'm really happy for them. But that's not a choice to me, and it's not a choice to you. And we are politicised just by who we are. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think there could ever be anything, even if I wrote I'm going to try and do a nice love story or something next time. But even that could be quite traumatic. Even that probably won't be. That will still be political. You're right. How can it not be?
Yeah,
it's not a choice. You're right. It's not a choice afforded to us.
Yeah, exactly. So I know we've been talking for absolutely ages, so I won't take up much more of your time. But what do you really hope for anyone that picks up Hidden Fires? What do you hope for those that read it?
I just hope that for those people who have very limited knowledge of partition or had absolutely no idea that such a thing happened, I hope it's a little introduction. Just because there are people who are much more qualified and much more knowledgeable than me about this subject. There's amazing books out there, podcasts out there, and documentaries, I hope it prompts people to go back and just look through all of that and learn more for themselves. I hope this is an introduction. That would really mean a lot to me because, like you said, for us, it's different in the sense that it is personal, but it's not just something that should concern us. This is British history. It's our shared history. And, everybody should know where they come from. Everybody should know why they are where they are. And that, again, doesn't just mean me and you. It means everybody, because this is British history. So that's the first thing. And secondly, I just think I'd love, because when it was after watching one of these documentaries and listening to all these stories, because the women were interviewed so much, it was mostly men. And that will have been obviously a conscious decision by, people. But I went to my grandma's house and she sent me down to the corner shop. Can you go get me some bread or something like that? I could just see Yusuf everywhere.
Oh,
and that's what happens in the book as well, because Ruby goes to the shop and everywhere she looks, she sees elderly men hobbling back from the shop, with their jinnah caps and their beards, and she sees women as well. And to me, it was like, these are like little boxes of trauma walking around. And they've lived quiet lives. They've lived dignified lives. And it's, for me, like, just to sort of add layers to those people that you just see, those signifiers, the mosque hat, the beard, the scarf, hobbling around, going about your sort of daily lives. Just, I don't know, I'd love for people to just see people like that out and about and just be, I don't know, prompted into sort of really thinking, like, look at the lives that these people have led. And that's not just like us again, because our grandparents look like that, just generally, just sort of take into consideration, because there are so many stories that have just gone. They're gone and they're about to go, because like you said, the people are, they're an elderly generation and they're leaving us, and we need to sort of appreciate them before they go.
Yeah, absolutely. On like in all manner of ways, I think, as well. Like, you described the relationship with your grandparents, and although I didn't have a huge amount of time with mine, like I still have very fond memories of my grandfather when I was very small, and my grandmother. And I think, we owe them, especially our generation, we owe them so much, because not only what they went through in partition and beyond, but the decisions that they made, the sacrifices they made to give us the life that we're living. Absolutely. Like, as you said, like your grandparents were unable to read and write, but look at you, you're a PhD holder and a published author, just 2 generations down. And that's only because of the sacrifices that they made, right? Like there's no two ways about that. So Sairish, as always, it has been such an honor, such a privilege speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Samia. You really are the best at what you do, and honestly, I could just stay here and carry on all day. But thank you for having me, and thank you for doing what you do with the podcast.
If you enjoyed this conversation with Sairish, then please do follow, like, subscribe to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast on your podcast platform of choice, and connect with me on social media. It would really help me if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.